Hollywood presents action films as perfectly orchestrated spectacles, yet the truth behind the camera often tells a very different story. Many iconic movies were just one rewrite away from becoming entirely new narratives, where villains could have been heroes and heroes almost lost their central place. Early scripts, casting notes, and private production discussions reveal decisions quietly made by studios, directors, and actors' choices that ultimately shaped the stories audiences know today. Some alterations occurred due to fear of audience reaction, internal politics, or an actor's insistence on changing their role. Tonight, we explore 15 action films where the villain nearly took the lead, uncovering hidden drafts, discarded scripts, and behind-the-scenes decisions that were carefully concealed. Each story illustrates how a single decision could have dramatically shifted the narrative, moral perspective, and emotional focus. From last-minute casting changes to narrative restructuring, these films hide a shadowed history that almost reversed hero and villain roles. By the end, you'll see how close some of the most memorable characters came to telling a different story, and how the choices behind the scenes determine the cinematic legends we celebrate today. Prepare to look behind the velvet curtain and discover the secrets that almost altered Hollywood history. Fact 1: Terminator 1984. In the earliest development of the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger was initially considered for Kyle Reese, the heroic soldier sent back to protect Sarah Connor, while the Terminator itself was envisioned as a more human-like figure blending subtly into the crowd. The first drafts emphasized Reese's courage and vulnerability, with the antagonist's presence more understated, relying on suspense and tension rather than overwhelming force. Studio executives debated whether Arnold's imposing physique could connect emotionally with audiences, fearing his size and screen presence might overshadow the role of the hero. During rehearsals, James Cameron observed Arnold's precise physical movements and intensity, recognizing that he perfectly embodied the relentless nature required for the Terminator. The casting adjustment shifted him into the iconic villain role, while Kyle Reese became a supportive yet critical character. Had the roles remained as originally intended, the film would have presented a vulnerable hero facing a subtly menacing antagonist, fundamentally altering audience perception. Archival notes and drafts reveal this hidden history, demonstrating how one pivotal decision can define the story's focus. The final film cemented Arnold as an enduring action villain, while Reese's role anchored the emotional and narrative trajectory, illustrating how directorial insight and studio decisions converge to create cinematic legend. Fact 2: Die Hard 1988. Early drafts of Die Hard gave Hans Gruber considerably more narrative weight than John McClane. Initially written as a sophisticated, morally complex character, Gruber's intelligence, charisma, and strategic planning positioned him nearly as a protagonist, inviting audience empathy. Extended scenes explored his motives and reasoning, presenting him as a compelling figure whose approach could have dominated the narrative. Studio executives, anticipating Alan Rickman's performance, worried that the villain's appeal might overshadow McClane's relatability. Rewrites simplified Gruber's objectives, clarified his criminal intentions, and expanded McClane's wit, vulnerability, and heroism to reinforce audience alignment. While Rickman's portrayal remains iconic, the early drafts suggest a film in which the audience could have been drawn to the antagonist, shifting moral focus and emotional investment. This behind-the-scenes intervention illustrates how studio oversight, character development, and narrative structuring work together to maintain hero prominence, while retaining a memorable villain, balancing tension, empathy, and storytelling in blockbuster cinema. Fact 3: The Dark Knight 2008. The first scripts for The Dark Knight positioned the Joker at the heart of the story, emphasizing his chaotic philosophy, calculated schemes, and psychological manipulations. Batman was conceived as a reactive figure responding to Joker's provocations rather than leading the narrative. Extensive sequences explored Joker's reasoning, potentially positioning him as the dominant narrative force. Studio executives grew concerned that this prominence could overshadow Batman, destabilizing the intended moral framework. Rewrites redistributed narrative weight, reduced Joker-centric exposition, and amplified Bruce Wayne's ethical and emotional journey to ensure audience focus remained on the hero. Heath Ledger's performance remains captivating, yet the final cut maintains Batman's centrality. Archival drafts reveal a version in which Joker's perspective almost controlled the story, showing how narrative framing, character emphasis, and studio oversight dictate audience alignment, ensuring the hero retains primacy while sustaining dramatic tension. Fact 4: Face/Off 1997. During the initial production phase of Face/Off, the casting plan had John Travolta as Castor Troy, the terrorist, and Nicolas Cage as FBI agent Sean Archer. Early drafts portrayed Archer as the disciplined, morally grounded protagonist, while Troy's character contained layers of charisma and strategic intelligence. Costume tests and preliminary readings reflected this configuration. Both actors expressed interest in swapping roles, believing the reversal would heighten tension and provide greater creative exploration. Director John Woo approved the change, reshaping the story's psychological complexity and suspense. Rewrites emphasized identity swaps, escalated emotional stakes, and strengthened character dynamics, resulting in a duel between actors portraying each other's identities. Archival drafts suggest that the original arrangement could have aligned audience empathy differently, potentially positioning Troy as a central figure. This casting shift illustrates the impact of actor input, directorial vision, and narrative restructuring, showing how small production choices can significantly affect the story's focus, suspense, and audience engagement in action cinema. Fact 5: Speed 1994. In the earliest scripts of Speed, Howard Payne was conceived as a psychologically nuanced character, a former bomb squad officer shaped by prior failures and motivated by recognition and respect rather than mere malice. His complex planning and use of the bus trap were initially framed as reactions to systemic neglect, not criminal greed. Jack Traven was depicted primarily as a responsive figure managing the escalating situation. Studio feedback raised concerns that audiences might sympathize with Payne more than Traven, potentially undermining the protagonist's alignment. Rewrites simplified Payne's objectives, highlighted the threat he posed, and reinforced Traven's heroism, intelligence, and moral clarity. Scene restructuring, dialogue adjustments, and tension pacing ensured audience alignment with the hero while preserving suspense. Archival materials reveal that early drafts contained greater moral ambiguity, suggesting a version where the lines between hero and villain were blurred. The final film clarified roles while maintaining high-stakes action, demonstrating how studio intervention, script refinement, and character emphasis shape audience perception in thriller narratives. Fact 6: RoboCop 1987. The original drafts of RoboCop focused on Dick Jones, the corporate executive, as the central figure, portraying him as a morally complex leader, seeking to restore order in a destabilized Detroit through technological innovation. Alex Murphy was a secondary character, his human experience subordinate to Jones's strategic decision-making and ethical dilemmas. The narrative explored corporate ethics, power, and practical morality through Jones's perspective. Studio concerns regarding audience identification prompted substantial rewrites, elevating Murphy to protagonist and redefining Jones as a clear antagonist. Dialogue scenes and character focus were adjusted to emphasize Murphy's humanity, ethical decision-making, and emotional journey while highlighting Jones's ambition and ruthless tendencies. Archival drafts reveal a narrative previously centered on a morally ambiguous corporate executive, illustrating how casting decisions, studio oversight, and story restructuring significantly influence character alignment, ethical interpretation, and audience empathy within action cinema. Fact 7: Lethal Weapon 1987. In early drafts of Lethal Weapon, Martin Riggs was portrayed as a dangerously unstable officer whose personal grief and psychological volatility made him a potential threat rather than a traditional hero. Scenes emphasized his unpredictable nature, creating tension within the story and uncertainty regarding audience alignment. Studio executives worried that viewers might struggle to empathize with a protagonist capable of sudden violence, potentially undermining the narrative. Rewrites softened Riggs, highlighting vulnerability, wit, and ethical judgment, while retaining tension and excitement. His relationship with Roger Murtaugh was expanded to provide emotional grounding and counterbalance Riggs's volatility. The final script established him as a flawed but relatable hero, maintaining suspense while clarifying moral alignment. Archival drafts reveal a darker, morally ambiguous version, illustrating the influence of studio guidance, script adjustments, and character development in shaping the audience's perception and defining a cinematic hero in action narratives. Fact 8: X-Men 2000. Before X-Men emphasized Wolverine and Professor Xavier, Magneto was conceived as the primary narrative perspective. Early drafts explored his traumatic history, ideology, and revolutionary motives, positioning him as a sympathetic figure whose worldview directed the story. Wolverine's role was initially secondary, highlighting Magneto's moral and strategic reasoning against human oppression. Studio executives expressed concern that a protagonist perceived as a villain could alienate mainstream audiences. Rewrites shifted focus to Wolverine, recasting Magneto as an antagonist, while trimming scenes that explored his philosophical depth. The final film centers on Wolverine's heroism, yet early drafts indicate a story almost told from Magneto's perspective, emphasizing the narrative power of the antagonist and illustrating how studio decisions, narrative framing, and audience expectations determine which characters dominate an action. Blockbuster's morale and emotional core. Fact 9: Predator 1987. Early drafts of Predator depicted Dutch as a ruthless mercenary whose skill set and behavior mirrored the Predator's instincts. The alien antagonist was conceived primarily as defensive, responding to human intrusion rather than initiating attacks. The narrative explored the ethical ambiguity of both hunter and hunted, creating complex tension. Arnold Schwarzenegger's casting prompted studio-mandated changes, recasting Dutch as a heroic figure embodying courage, loyalty, and ethical integrity, while portraying the Predator as the primary threat. Script and scene adjustments reinforced Dutch's heroism, clarified audience alignment, and maintained suspense. Archival documents reveal a version in which moral boundaries were blurred, showing how casting, studio oversight, and narrative restructuring can dramatically shape audience perception, character alignment, and ethical interpretation in action cinema. The final film established Dutch as an iconic hero and the Predator as a terrifying adversary, while hidden drafts suggest a far more ambiguous early conception. Fact 10: Skyfall 2012. During early script development of Skyfall, Silva was depicted as a former MI6 operative returning to assist Bond and protect M from internal threats, rather than as a vengeful antagonist. These drafts emphasized his strategic mind, moral ambiguity, and complex motivations, portraying him as someone whose perspective influenced the narrative and challenged Bond's ethical framework. Studio executives feared audiences might sympathize with Silva if he was too nuanced, potentially reducing the impact of his eventual villainous turn. Rewrites reframed Silva as the central antagonist, emphasizing revenge obsession and psychological manipulation while reducing scenes highlighting his moral ambiguity. Bond's perspective was prioritized as the story's moral anchor. The final film presents the iconic confrontation between hero and villain, but archival drafts reveal a nearly inverted narrative in which Silva's point of view guided the story, demonstrating how studio oversight, character focus, and narrative restructuring shape audience perception and maintain the intended alignment between hero and antagonist. Fact 11, First Blood, 1982. In the original drafts of First Blood, John Rambo was portrayed as a dangerous and unpredictable ex-soldier whose skills and psychological instability posed a threat to the town and its authorities. Sheriff Teasle was initially the protagonist, managing the chaos Rambo created while representing order and authority. Early scenes emphasized Rambo's capacity for violence, portraying him as morally ambiguous and potentially menacing. Sylvester Stallone's participation prompted rewrites to humanize Rambo, shifting him into a sympathetic hero reacting to systemic neglect and personal trauma. Scenes were restructured and dialogue altered to elicit audience empathy, centering the narrative on Rambo's survival and moral journey. Archival drafts reveal an alternate story in which Rambo's dangerous nature dominated, highlighting how actor input, studio oversight, and script adjustments can drastically alter narrative focus, character alignment, and thematic resonance, transforming a threatening figure into a celebrated protagonist. Fact 12, The Bourne Identity, 2002. Early treatments of the Bourne Identity positioned Treadstone, the covert program, as a heroic organization containing a rogue agent whose actions threatened international security. Jason Bourne was depicted as unpredictable, potentially dangerous, and his amnesia intensified the threat. The narrative emphasized the agency's perspective, portraying Bourne primarily as a risk to be neutralized. Casting Matt Damon and prioritizing audience empathy prompted significant rewrites, positioning Bourne as the protagonist and Treadstone as morally ambiguous antagonists. Dialogue, scene emphasis, and narrative focus were adjusted to highlight Bourne's struggle for identity, agency, and survival, while the agency's operations were framed as oppressive. Archival materials indicate a near reversal in the early story, in which Bourne's actions could have been interpreted as villainous, demonstrating how casting, narrative, perspective, and studio oversight define hero and antagonist alignment and shape audience perception in espionage thrillers. Fact 13, Batman, 1989. During the early stages of Batman, the Joker was considered the central character, with scripts emphasizing his chaotic philosophy, strategic schemes, and manipulative personality. The narrative explored his worldview, portraying him as a figure who could dominate audience perception and guide the moral tone of the story. Michael Keaton was even briefly considered for the role, demonstrating the studio's willingness to experiment with casting choices. Tim Burton intervened to ensure Batman remained the primary hero, leading to Jack Nicholson's casting and the restructuring of key sequences. Dialogue, visual framing, and pacing were adjusted to maintain Batman's prominence while preserving Joker's menace. Archival drafts reveal a nearly inverted story in which Joker's perspective controlled the narrative, illustrating how casting, directorial oversight, and studio decisions determine which character dominates audience focus and narrative alignment in action cinema. Fact 14, The Rock, 1996. Early drafts of The Rock centered on General Francis Hummel as the protagonist, portraying him as a heroic figure seeking justice for fallen soldiers while confronting government corruption. His intelligence, moral judgment, and strategic planning formed the narrative core. Studio concerns regarding audience alignment and potential political controversy prompted rewrites that repositioned Hummel as the antagonist and emphasized the perspective of the hero team. Scenes exploring Hummel's ethical conflict and motivations were reduced, dialogue was altered, and visual emphasis shifted to reinforce the protagonist's journey. Despite these changes, Ed Harris's performance retained subtle traces of the character's original complexity. Archival scripts reveal a story in which Hummel's moral authority nearly made him the central figure, demonstrating how studio guidance, narrative restructuring, and character focus shape audience perception and define moral alignment in action films. Fact 15, Con Air 1997. In the earliest drafts of Con Air Cameron, Poe was depicted as a highly dangerous inmate whose intelligence, adaptability, and moral flexibility shaped interactions with other prisoners, particularly Cyrus the Virus. The narrative emphasized the tension and ambiguity of Poe's role within the morally complex environment of the transport flight. Studio intervention transformed Poe into a noble protagonist seeking to reunite with his family, while Cyrus's character was elevated as the central antagonist. Dialogue, scene structure, and character focus were rewritten to align audience empathy with Poe and clarify narrative stakes. Archival materials reveal a version in which moral boundaries were blurred, illustrating how casting decisions, studio influence, and script revisions can dramatically alter character perception, audience alignment, and thematic emphasis, highlighting the delicate balance of storytelling and high stakes. Action narratives. Bonus fact, the action classic that hid its true villain until the final cut. One of Hollywood's most celebrated action films was initially conceived with the antagonist at the story's center, portraying his motivations, strategies, and personal struggles as the driving force. Early production materials, including storyboards and script drafts, emphasized the villain's intelligence, ethical reasoning, and complex psychology, while the hero's role was largely reactive. Studio executives expressed concern that audiences might empathize too strongly with the antagonist, undermining the intended hero-driven narrative. To address this, significant revisions were implemented. Dialogue highlighting the villain's sympathetic qualities was removed. Sequences were re-edited to enhance the hero's emotional and moral prominence, and camera work was adjusted to reinforce protagonist focus. Post-production ensured the villain remained compelling but subordinate to the hero's journey. While the released film presents a conventional hero versus villain story, archival documents reveal a near-complete alternate narrative in which the villain's perspective almost dominated. This hidden history illustrates how studio oversight, editorial restructuring, and narrative framing can dramatically influence audience perception, character alignment, and thematic impact. The concealed iteration demonstrates that even the most iconic films contain suppressed creative possibilities, revealing how careful production decisions maintain moral clarity, audience engagement, and narrative coherence. Behind the scenes, this untold story remains a testament to Hollywood's capacity to reshape narratives, balancing tension, suspense, and ethical clarity, while preserving the hero's primacy and ensuring the intended cinematic experience. After uncovering how close some villains came to becoming heroes, it becomes clear that Hollywood's most celebrated action films were shaped by countless unseen decisions. Casting choices, script rewrites, and editorial changes determined which characters audiences would empathize with and how moral alignment was presented. Behind every iconic hero lies a hidden history of near reversals and discarded narratives. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the secrets behind the scenes, revealing hidden drafts, untold stories, and decisions that studio executives never intended the public to see. The next revelations are waiting, ready to expose more hidden truths about your favorite action films.